For almost a year, Olivia Hayes had watched him without ever saying a word. Every morning at 6, she stood behind the second-floor glass of her lakeside house, a cup of black coffee, going cold between her palms, her eyes fixed on the porch across the street. There, a man knelt on the worn wooden boards, gathering his small daughter's hair into a careful ponytail before school. His hands were steady, patient, the kind of patient Olivia had never been given by anyone. Seattle knew her as the woman who could end a meeting with a single glance. No one knew about the window. No one knew about the coffee that always went cold. Then, one autumn afternoon, Caleb Foster walked past her gate with another woman on his arm, laughing the way Olivia had only ever watched from behind glass. Something inside her cracked, quiet, and clean. The fence had been the beginning of it, though Olivia would not have called it that. One spring evening, the kind when Seattle's rain finally relents and the air smells of cedar and wet stone, she came home to find one of the back panels of her wooden fence leaning at a wrong angle, half collapsed against a hydrangea bush. She'd been on a conference call from her car working through revisions on the Bellevue penthouse, and she stood in the driveway in her heels, looking at the broken slat, the way she looked at any problem as something to be solved before sundown. She was reaching for her phone when she heard the saw. Across the street, a screen door swung open, and a man stepped out. Sleeves rolled to the elbow sawdust, pale on the dark hair of his forearms. He had a small girl on his hip, and the girl was pointing at Olivia's fence with the gravity of someone making a diagnosis. He set her down on the porch step, told her to stay, and walked across the street with a hammer and a fistful of nails. He did not introduce himself with anything more than his name: Caleb Foster. He fixed the fence in 20 minutes, refused the bills she pressed toward him, and when she insisted, he lifted his eyes once to take her in without judgment, without recognition, without anything she was used to seeing in a man's face. "I had the wood anyway," he said. "It's nothing." The girl on the porch waved at her with both hands. Olivia, who had not been waved at in any genuine way in years, lifted her fingers in a small, awkward answer. She felt for a reason she could not name, as if something behind her ribs had been quietly unlatched. The neighborhood was a curve of houses along the western edge of Lake Washington, old craftsman homes, big porches, a few newer glass and steel rebuilds like Olivia's. People kept to themselves out here, which was why she had bought it. After the magazine profile, after the funding, round her last boyfriend had emptied with a smile and a forwarded email chain, she had wanted nothing more than a door that locked and a view that did not include any other living person. She had paid cash. She had not introduced herself to a single neighbor. But Caleb Foster lived directly across her line of sight. His workshop, a converted carriage house at the back of his lot, was visible from her kitchen window, the warm yellow rectangle of its open bay door glowing late into the evenings. Foster and Daughter, the hand-painted sign above the door read in a curling letter style that looked as if it had been drawn by a child's enthusiastic hand and then corrected by an adult's. Furniture. Heirloom pieces. Slow work. She told herself she was only ever looking at the sign. By midsummer, the looking had become a kind of weather inside her, something she lived under, without remarking on. She knew the rhythm of his mornings before she knew her own. 6 o'clock, the porch light. 6:15, the screen door. The pink backpack, the careful ponytail done one-handed, while a piece of toast was held in the other. Sophie, she had heard him call her once across the lawn. Sophie. Hold still, sweetheart. In August, she had her assistant place an order at the workshop under a holding company name, a single walnut writing desk, custom proportions delivered when ready. It was the kind of small dishonesty she would have fired anyone else for. She told herself she needed a desk. She did not tell herself the desk was only an excuse to one day stand inside the room where he worked. She finally went in October, the morning the workshop called to say the desk was ready for inspection. She wore jeans for the first time in months, heels in his sawdust, felt obscene somehow, and brought her own coffee in a paper cup. The workshop smelled of cedar and linseed oil, and something faintly sweeter, like resin warming in sun. Caleb met her at the door with hands wiped on the front of his jeans, and she watched the recognition surface in his face, slowly, as if he were translating her from one language into another. The CEO of Hayes Atelier in his shop. The neighbor across the street also. "You're the holding company," he said, almost amused. She felt the corner of her own mouth give. "I'm the holding company." He walked her through the desk. He showed her the joinery the way a man shows you a thing he loves not selling, just naming. Mortise. Tannon. Hand-rubbed oil, finished 12 coats, 2 weeks of drying between. She listened. She wanted in a way that startled her to put her hand on his wrist, where the cuff of his shirt had folded back. She did not. Instead, she walked the length of the shop and saw on the high shelf above the lathe a framed photograph. A young woman with sun in her hair, sitting in a wooden rocking chair, on a porch, one hand resting on a pregnant belly. The chair was familiar. Olivia could see it now in the back corner of the workshop, set apart from the working clutter, draped in a clean canvas cloth. She did not ask. She did not need to. The way Caleb's eyes lifted to that shelf and then away told her everything she would not be told aloud. When she left with her desk that afternoon, she made a small, careful decision behind her ribs. She would be neighborly. She would be kind to the little girl who waved with both hands. She would not let herself want anything she had no right to want. That was almost a year ago. The window came after. The second-floor glass, the cup of coffee that always went cold, the 6:15 ritual she did not admit to anyone, least of all herself. Some mornings, she told herself it was the lake she was looking at. Some mornings, she did not bother with the lie. Then Lauren Brooks arrived. She came the second week of September, the way weather arrives without announcement, and changing everything by the second day. Olivia first saw her on a Tuesday afternoon, driving home from a site visit, the road along the lake, half shadowed in early autumn light. She slowed at the small park where the elementary school let out, and there on the long arc of a swing was Sophie Pigtails. This time, not the usual ponytail kicking her sneakers toward the sky. A woman stood behind her, both hands on the chains, pushing. The woman was laughing. Caleb stood a few feet off with his hands in his back pockets, his head tilted in the soft, listening way he had when his daughter was talking. He was smiling at the woman. Easy. Familiar. Olivia's foot stayed too long on the brake. Behind her, a car horn, short and polite, and she drove on. She learned the name within the week, the way one learns names in a neighborhood through a casual sentence at the coffee shop. Lauren Brooks, the new second-grade teacher at Green Lake Elementary, an old college friend of Caleb Foster's, just moved up from Portland. Single. Warm. Loved the kids already. The woman at the counter said it like a small piece of good news the whole street had been waiting for. Olivia drank her coffee black and said nothing. The next morning at 6:15, she was not at the window. She had set her alarm 20 minutes earlier and was already in her car by 6, easing out of her driveway in the gray pre-light. She did not look at his porch. She told herself this was efficiency. She told herself this was the new project schedule for the New York expansion her board had been pressing her to take. She did not let herself notice that her hands were tight on the wheel or that she had not finished her coffee. For a week, she managed it. For a week, the porch light came on, and the screen door opened, and Caleb Foster knelt on his worn wooden boards to do his daughter's hair, and there was no one behind the second-floor glass to watch him. He noticed on the 8th day. She knew he noticed, because of the way he stood. The afternoon she finally came home in the middle of the day, a meeting canceled the rare gift of an empty hour and saw him at his mailbox. He looked up. He lifted a hand the way he always did. She lifted hers back, but she did not stop the car, and she watched in her rearview mirror as he stayed where he was. The envelopes in his hand forgotten a long, slow look she had not earned with anything she had said. 3 days later, Caleb was alone in the workshop after dinner, finishing the last coat on a child's bookcase, when Sophie came down the gravel path in her socks, with a piece of construction paper in her hand. "You're not supposed to be out here without shoes," he said without looking up. "I drew Miss Olivia," Sophie said. He looked up. His daughter held out the drawing. It was Olivia, recognizably. So the dark hair, the long coat, the small, careful smile she had given Sophie once or twice last spring, standing on a porch that was clearly their porch, not hers. In the drawing, Olivia was waving with both hands. "She didn't wave today," Sophie said. "She didn't wave yesterday either. She used to." Caleb set the brush down on the rim of the can. "She's sad," his daughter went on in the matter-of-fact way she announced weather. "Since Miss Lauren came over for dinner that time, I think she's sad about that." He did not answer right away. He looked at the drawing. He looked at the high shelf above the lathe at Emma's photograph at the rocking chair, under its clean canvas cloth, in the back corner, at the long shape of a life he had built around an absence, and learned to call enough. Then he looked through the open bay door across the dark lawn at the lit second-floor window of the lakeside house across the street. He had told himself for almost a year that he had imagined the looking. That a woman like Olivia Hayes, the magazine, covers the glass towers downtown, the cool, untouchable competence of her, could not possibly be looking back. He had told himself this so many times, it had become the shape of his evenings, a small, private rule, like the one about Emma's chair. But his daughter had just told him, without meaning to, that he had been wrong. He should have walked across the street that night. He should have knocked on her door and asked her simply the question he was almost afraid to know the answer to. He did not. Instead, the next morning, when Lauren texted to ask if she could bring dinner over on Friday, something casual, nothing serious, the easy kind of message an old friend sends, he wrote back, "Yes." He told himself it was harmless. He told himself he only wanted to know for certain whether the woman across the street would keep looking away, the way she had been looking away for weeks, or whether she would do something he could not yet name. It was the smallest dishonesty of his life. He would come to call it the worst. She told herself the next morning that she was being absurd. A woman in her position did not lose sleep over a porch across the street. A woman in her position made decisions, signed quarterly reports, sat in chairs upholstered in $20,000 leather, and told men twice her age what their buildings should feel like when a person walked into them. A woman in her position did not stand barefoot in her own kitchen at 5 in the morning, watching the dark windows of a workshop across a strip of lawn and waiting for a light to come on. But she did. That Wednesday morning and the Thursday morning after. By Friday, she had built the case against herself, the way she built cases against bad investments. The arguments were clean. She had spent the better part of 2 decades constructing a life that did not depend on any other human being, and the construction had been good, structurally sound. To dismantle a building like that, for a man whose every shirt was older than her last handbag, was not romance. It was sentimentality. She did not do sentimentality. She had a board meeting in San Francisco on Tuesday. She had a Bellevue install on Wednesday. She had on her desk a folder labeled Hayes Atelier East, a proposal her chief of operations had been pushing for 8 months, the New York expansion, a corner office on Madison Avenue, with afternoon light her designers had already drafted the plans for. She could be on a plane in 72 hours. She could be a different woman by November. She told herself all of this calmly and well, and then she watched out of the corner of her eye as Lauren Brooks's hatchback turned into the Foster driveway at 7:06 that Friday evening, carrying what looked very much like a casserole dish. The casserole dish was somehow the worst part. The casserole dish was the most domestic thing she had ever seen in her life. Across the street, Caleb was a man holding his own apology in his hands and not quite knowing what to do with it. He had cleaned the workshop that afternoon, not for Lauren, who had never asked to see it, but the way men clean things when they are trying to think. He had swept the long aisles between the workbenches. He had stacked the offcuts. He had stood for a long time in the back corner of the shop, looking at the canvas-draped shape of the rocking chair, and he had not pulled the cloth back. He had been a husband once to a woman who used to sit in that chair in the last months before Sophie was born, reading him paint-chip names out loud and laughing at the ones that sounded like dessert. He had been the man holding her hand 3 years later in a hospital room with the blinds drawn against an afternoon that had no business being sunny. He had been the father who taught a 4-year-old how to say the word, gone, about her mother, and not flinch. He did not know yet whether he had the right to be anything else, but he stood at the back of his shop that Friday afternoon and admitted to himself for the first time honestly that the looking went both ways, that it had gone both ways from the spring he fixed her fence, that when he stood at his workbench in the evenings and felt the back of his neck warm without reason, it was because on the far side of a strip of lawn, a woman who could buy his entire street twice over was standing at a kitchen window with a cup of something cold in her hand. And he had been lying to himself about it for almost a year. Lauren arrived at 7. She brought the casserole, and she brought her easy laugh, and she sat on his back porch with Sophie tucked under one arm, while Caleb grilled corn over coals that were not quite hot enough. From across the street through a screen of birch leaves, the lakeside house showed a single lit upstairs window that did not move. He watched the window all evening, and he hated himself for watching it, and he kept watching. The neighborhood association called the autumn festival the same thing every year, the harvest on the water, and put it on the long stretch of grass between the boat launch and the old picnic shelter the first Saturday of October. There were string lights between the maples. There were cider donuts from a stand, whose owner had been making them since before Sophie was born. There was a small wooden stage at the far end of the green, where someone's nephew always played acoustic guitar a little too loud. Olivia went because she had said she would. She had RSVP'd in August, before Lauren, before any of it, and the chairwoman of the association was a former client whose Capitol Hill townhouse Olivia had finished in slate and brushed brass 2 summers ago. She owed her a face. She arrived late. She had come straight from a 4-hour video call with her New York consultants. The offer on the Madison Avenue lease was on the table, and she had told them that afternoon that she was inclined to take it, and she was still in the charcoal suit she had worn for the call, her hair pulled back her heels too high for grass. She felt walking onto the green like a piece of architecture in the wrong neighborhood. She saw them before they saw her. Caleb was standing near the donut stand, with Sophie on his hip, too big to be carried, but he was carrying her anyway, the way fathers carry their daughters at festivals, when the daughters have eaten too much sugar and gotten quiet. Lauren stood beside him, half turned toward him, her hand lifted to the collar of his shirt. She was straightening it. It was a small, unthinking gesture, the kind of thing women do for men they are practicing being domestic with. And Sophie was watching the wooden stage and did not see it, and Caleb was looking down at the top of his daughter's head and did not stop it. Olivia turned around in the grass and walked. She did not run. She had not run from anything since she was 19 years old. She walked the way she walked out of bad meetings with her chin level and her hand loose at her side, and her keys already finding her palm inside her coat pocket. Behind her, the acoustic guitar started into something slow. The string lights came on. She was halfway across the gravel of the parking lot when she heard her name. Olivia. He had left Sophie with Lauren. She knew it without turning. She heard him jog the last few yards, the soft sound of his boots on gravel, and then he was beside her, breathing the way a man breathes when he has just understood something a beat too late. Olivia, wait. She did not look at him. She had her keys in the door. Her hand was steady. Her hand was so steady it frightened her. You don't owe me an explanation, Caleb. I'm not trying to explain anything. Then don't. Her voice came out quieter than she meant it. Go back to your daughter. Look at me. She did not. Olivia. He was near enough now that she could smell the cedar in his jacket, the faint smoke of the donut grill, something else underneath that she had spent a year teaching herself not to learn the name of. "Why do you look like I just hurt you?" She turned then. She turned because she had to, because not turning would have been the worst kind of confession, and she found him close enough that she could see the flecks of darker brown in his eyes and the small new line between his brows. "Because you don't owe me anything." Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that later, in the cold, honest way one is proud of small, useless things. "That's the part that hurts. You don't owe me a single thing. Caleb Foster and I have been standing at a kitchen window for almost a year pretending that wasn't true." She did not wait for him to answer. She got into the car. She closed the door. She drove out of the gravel lot with both hands on the wheel and the lake going by in the dark on her left, like a long-held breath, and she did not let herself cry until she was on the freeway, and the lights of the city were small enough to be mistaken for stars. She signed the New York lease on Monday morning at 9:15. She did it from her office on the 42nd floor of the Hayes Atelier Tower, in a chair her father had sat in once before. He died with a fountain pen she had bought for herself the year she made her first million. Her chief of operations cried briefly and tidily, and then ordered champagne for the floor. By noon, the announcement was internal. By 3, it was on a trade blog. By the end of the week, the movers had a date. She gave herself 2 weeks in Seattle to close the house. Caleb did not come over. She had thought in the small, ungoverned hours that he might. He did not. She told herself this was the right thing, and the telling was almost a kind of relief almost, until across the street in the workshop, Caleb was on his knees in front of the rocking chair. He had pulled the canvas back. He had pulled it back that afternoon, finally, after a week of standing in front of it, with his arms folded and his throat full of something he could not swallow. The chair was just a chair. He had forgotten that somehow. Cherry wood hand-turned spindles the small, dark spot on the left armrest, where Emma had spilled coffee the first morning he brought it home. He sat down in it. He had not sat in it since the funeral. "I'm sorry," he said out loud to the empty workshop. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I have been using you." The maples outside the open bay door moved in a small wind. "I have been using your chair, and your picture, and the shape of the life we didn't get to finish as a place to hide. And there is a woman across the street who has been standing in her own kitchen for a year because of me, and I have been a coward, Em. I have been the kind of coward I would not let our daughter grow up to marry." He put his face in his hands. He did not cry. He had cried himself empty about Emma a long time ago in a hospital chapel, with industrial carpet, and what he felt now was different, quieter. More like a man setting down a weight he had been carrying so long, he had stopped noticing his own crooked spine. "I'm going to love someone else," he told the chair. "If she lets me. And I think you would have liked her, Em. I think you would have been furious with me for taking this long." He sat in the rocking chair for a long time. Then he got up, and he washed his hands, and he went to find Lauren. He met her at the coffee shop near the school the next morning. He told her the truth, that he had been unfair to her, that he had let her come to his house twice in the last month because he wanted someone to see, and that the someone was not her. Lauren listened with her hands wrapped around her cup, and her face did the small, brave thing women's faces do when they are receiving a thing they already half knew. "I knew," she said when he was done. "Caleb, I knew from the day I straightened your collar. You didn't look at me. You looked at the parking lot." He could not answer that. "It's okay," she said more gently than he deserved. "I hope she's worth the year you spent not telling her." He drove home with the windows down and the radio off, and he did not yet know that that same afternoon, his daughter was on a stool by the front register of the school office, kicking her sneakers against the metal and listening to the receptionist on the phone behind her say, "Yes, Mr. Foster's neighbor is moving. I heard the big house on the lake end of the month." He did not yet know that his 7-year-old daughter would walk home that afternoon and stand in the doorway of his workshop with her backpack still on her shoulders, and her chin doing the small, terrible thing it did when she was trying not to cry, and ask him in a voice he would remember for the rest of his life, whether everyone he loved was always going to leave. He had no answer for her that did not feel like a lie. So he went out to the shop that night after she was asleep, and he finished it. The box had been sitting unfinished on the high shelf above his bench since the end of summer walnut. No bigger than the span of his hand, the lid joined at the corners with the same mortise and tenon he had named for her in the spring. He had built it 3 months ago without knowing why. He had not been able to look at it since. Tonight he took it down. He gave it the final sanding, the kind that takes wood down to silk. He oiled it. He let it dry. He set it on the workbench beside the finished writing desk, the desk she had left in his care, telling herself it was easier than moving it twice, and he called her phone at 6 in the morning. He did not say much. He said the desk was ready and asked her to come pick it up that night before the movers came. He said please. He had never said please to her before. She came at 9. The workshop was lit only by the 2 pendant lamps over the long workbench, and the warm yellow of them made the cedar shavings on the floor look almost gold. The desk stood in the center of the room, under a clean drop cloth, half pulled back. The walnut was the color of dark honey. Beside the desk on the bench sat the small wooden box, no bigger than the span of his hand. Caleb was standing by the back corner of the shop, near the rocking chair, with his sleeves pushed up and his hands at his sides, like a man who had been told to keep them there. "There's a note inside the box," he said. She walked to the bench. She lifted the lid. The inside was lined with felt the color of dried lavender, and there was a single folded paper. She read it standing up. She read it twice. "I made this 3 months ago. I didn't know what I was going to put in it. I'm going to tell you the truth now, and you can decide whether the box is empty for good." She set the note down on the bench. Caleb. Lauren was an excuse. His voice was rough. He had been saying the sentence in his head for days, and it came out in a single tired breath. "I knew you were looking. I think I have known since the day I fixed your fence. And I let her keep coming because I was a coward, and I needed to know whether you would say something, because I was too afraid to say it first. I am sorry, Olivia. I have been a man who lost his wife and decided that meant he didn't have to risk anything else ever, and I have hurt you for a year for it." She did not look at him. She looked at the small box. "I'm not asking you to stay for me." He took 1 step into the lamplight and stopped. "I'm asking you not to leave because of me. There is a difference. I want you to know there is a difference." The first tear took her by surprise. She had not cried in front of another person since she was 19 years old, and it did not feel the way she had been afraid it would feel. It felt like setting something down. She put her hand over her mouth, and she let the second one come, and the third, and Caleb crossed the rest of the workshop in 3 steps, and did not touch her, only stood close enough that she could lean if she chose to. She chose to. She leaned her forehead against the front of his shirt, and she felt his hand come up careful to the back of her hair, and outside the open bay door, the maples moved in a small October wind, and the workshop smelled of cedar and linseed oil, and something faintly sweeter, like resin warming in lamplight, like the year she had spent learning the shape of a room she had never let herself walk into. They sat down eventually on the edge of the workbench. He brought her a glass of water from the small sink by the back door. She drank half of it. The drop cloth on the writing desk had slipped further back, exposing the long edge of walnut he had spent the better part of a season making for her, and she found she could not look at the desk without something in her chest folding in on itself. "I don't know how to do this, Caleb." He waited. "I am very good at one thing." Her voice was steadier now, but only just. "I am very good at building things that do not need anybody. That is the only kind of building I have ever known how to do. I have never been someone's mother. I would not know where to start with a 7-year-old who has already had a mother and lost her. I would spend the rest of my life knowing I was the second answer to a question your daughter never wanted to ask. She set the glass down on the bench. There is a picture of Emma on your shelf, and there is a chair in your back corner, and there is a whole shape of a life in this room that I have no language for. I would be afraid every day of doing it wrong. And the worst part is I would rather be afraid every day with you than not afraid in a corner office in New York. And that is the most terrifying sentence I have ever said out loud. Caleb looked at his hands. Sophie doesn't need you to replace her mother, Olivia. He said it carefully, the way he handled wood that he loved. She has a mother. Emma is her mother. That will always be true. What Sophie needs, what I need, is somebody who comes home. Somebody who is in the kitchen on a Tuesday. Somebody who knows where we keep the cereal bowls. That is not a small job. That is the whole job. And if you do it badly some days, that is also part of the job. None of us are doing it well every day. He looked up at her then. You don't have to be her mother. You only have to be the person who stays. She did not answer him with words. She reached over and took his hand off his own knee and held it palm up on the workbench between them and traced with one fingertip the small white line of an old scar across the base of his thumb. He let her. Outside somewhere on the lake, a loon called once and went quiet. Sophie came by herself the next afternoon. She came on foot in her pink jacket with the sleeves a little too short, and she stood on the front step of the lakeside house with both hands wrapped around a folded piece of construction paper. She rang the bell twice the way her father had taught her. Olivia opened the door in a sweater and bare feet, and her face did a small, surprised thing at the size of her visitor. My dad doesn't know I'm here. Sophie said it the way one confesses a misdemeanor. I walked from school. I'm allowed to, but only to our house. I took the long way. I'll tell him later. Olivia stepped aside. Come in, sweetheart. Sophie did not sit down. She stood in the front hall on the wide, pale floorboards, and she held out the folded piece of paper with both hands. I made this a while ago, she said. I was going to wait, but I heard about the moving. So I'm not waiting. Olivia unfolded the page. It was a drawing in colored pencil, Sophie's careful, slightly crooked hand. 3 figures stood in front of a house. The house had a porch. The man wore a brown shirt. The little girl had 2 yellow pigtails. The 3rd figure was a woman with dark hair and a small, careful smile standing close enough to the other 2 that her elbow touched the man's elbow. In the upper right corner, in block letters, Sophie had written, Us. I didn't know what to call it. Sophie was looking at her sneakers. I tried family, but I wasn't sure if it was okay. So I wrote, Us. Is us okay? Olivia knelt down on the front hall floor in her sweater. She realized, eye level now with a 7-year-old who had walked the long way home because she did not want to lose another person. She held the drawing very carefully, the way she had held architectural sketches that mattered. Us is okay, Sophie. Us is perfect. The little girl considered her for a long moment. You don't have to be like my mom, Sophie said finally with the strange, clean wisdom of children. I already had one of those. I just want you to be like you. The you who waves at me in the morning. That you was already pretty good. Olivia found to her astonishment that she was crying again, the 2nd time in 2 days, the 2nd time in 18 years. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and laughed once wet and small. Okay, she said. Okay, sweetheart. That you. I can do that. You. She called New York on Wednesday morning. She did not cancel the lease. She had spent 2 decades learning that you do not throw away leverage. You reshape it. She kept the Madison Avenue office and put her chief of operations in it, a promotion the woman had been quietly earning for 3 years, and she pulled herself back to Seattle as principal designer of a new vertical. The trade press would 6 months later call the most interesting move in luxury furniture in a decade. Hayes Times Foster, a collaboration line. Custom heirloom pieces built by hand in a converted carriage house on the west side of Lake Washington, finished and styled and sold through the showrooms of Hayes Atelier in Seattle, San Francisco, and yes, New York. The first piece in the line was a walnut writing desk with mortise and tenon joinery and 12 coats of hand-rubbed oil. It sold for $18,000 before the catalog went to print. Caleb hired 2 apprentices that winter. He kept the Foster and Daughter sign exactly where it was. And one evening in late November, when the first real cold had come down off the mountains, he carried the rocking chair out of the back corner of the workshop and into the living room of the house across the lawn from Olivia's. He put it by the window that faced the water. He did not cover it. Sophie sat in it the next morning to eat her cereal. Olivia, the first time she saw it there, did not say anything. She only walked over and put her hand on the back of it briefly, the way one greets a person one has not yet been introduced to, but means to know. A year after the night in the workshop, Hayes Times Foster opened its flagship showroom on First Avenue in Pioneer Square. The space was a converted warehouse with 20-foot ceilings and exposed brick, and the long, honeyed light of a Pacific Northwest evening coming through the west windows. Half the city was there. A photographer from a national magazine moved through the crowd taking pictures of the cherry sideboards, the walnut dining tables, the small handmade boxes lined in, felt the color of dried lavender that were already sold out for the holidays. Olivia stood at a low microphone near the front, in a cream-colored dress without a jacket, her hair down for the first time at a professional event in 15 years. She was thanking the team, which was a thing she had never been good at in public, and she was in the middle of a sentence about the carpenter who had built every piece in the room when a small figure in a navy blue dress walked out from behind the curtain at her left and stopped at her elbow. Sophie had grown 2 inches in a year. She was holding the small walnut box from the workshop in both hands, very seriously. The crowd quieted. "Dad said it would take him a year to ask," Sophie announced into the microphone with the perfect dry timing of a child who has practiced. "I decided to ask for him." The crowd, which was largely composed of Seattle business people trained from birth to never laugh in public, laughed. Caleb stepped out from behind the curtain, a beat later, in the only suit he owned, looking like a man who had lost a small argument with his daughter and was not entirely sorry about it. He came to stand in front of Olivia. He did not kneel right away. He waited until Sophie had opened the lid of the box and offered it to him, two-handed, with the gravity of a small priest. Then he knelt. Olivia said yes before he finished the sentence. She said it into the microphone by accident, and the room heard it and made a sound she would remember as long as she remembered anything. Late that night after the caterers had left, and the showroom was dark, and the long string of taillights had turned off First Avenue and gone home. She stood on the back porch of the house across the strip of lawn from her own. The lake was black and quiet. Behind her, through the open kitchen door, she could hear Caleb laughing at something Sophie had said. Something about whether you were allowed to wear sneakers to a wedding, and then the soft crash of a bowl that had not survived the discussion. More laughter. A small voice yelling, "Sorry, Dad." Olivia looked down at her left hand. The ring caught the porch light small and warm. For most of her life, she had thought she was building a tower. She had thought the goal was the height of it, the view from the top, the way the city looked, when you were the one who had drawn its skyline. Standing on this porch, with a 7-year-old's apology drifting out behind her on the cedar-smelling air, she understood finally that she had never wanted the tower. She had only ever wanted somewhere to come home to, and someone in a lit kitchen behind her to be waiting when she did.